everybody. Welcome to Elevate Your E-commerce. I am Dan Laugharn. Before I joined Vercel about a year ago, I was a lifelong Vercel user, well, as lifelong as serverless web development could be. But I led engineering at a company called Made in Cookware, where we made an e-commerce website. And that's kind of my bread and butter. That's the thing that I'm really passionate about, is composable commerce. So, and before that, I was at a different company. Before that, I was a different company. But back in 2017, that's when I first shipped my first Nuxt app to Zeit. And I've really been on composability kind of ever since. Helping me out today is my boss, Diggory. So if you could leave a 5-star review with him on your way out, that would be appreciated. So many of you received a link, I believe, in the email that had a repository that we want to use today. And if not, flag him down. But you can go to shipworkshopshop.com to kind of browse along with you. But you can go to git.shipworkshopshop.com to get a link to the repository. And if you are playing along locally, go to env.shipworkshopshop.com to get an environment variable that will let you use some of the features that we're going to be using today. So yeah, like I was given 40 minutes to do an e-commerce workshop, which I feel like I could do 40 hours on e-commerce, truth be told. So what can we do in 40 minutes to illustrate to you guys? And on the topic of elevating your e-commerce, I think there are a million different ways that we can kind of think about elevation. But for me, elevating the experience of e-commerce comes down to relevance, performance, and control. We base this on so I'm on the sales engineering team, so I talk to a lot of people about, why they might want to use Vercel, what they're building. And we found these topics that come up time and time again are things like localization, personalization, just experimentation, context awareness, all of these kind of things where what we're saying is that the experience of hitting a URL is no longer going to be the same from person to person. And for a lot of people, they use the term personalization to describe this as kind of a catch-all. But for some of us, that personalization means something very specific. That means I am showing this user this thing and not this user. But I think a lot of them, they exist kind of on a spectrum. A lot of our implementations of these can be really similar to each other. So I put them together as this idea of relevance. But when it comes to relevance, historically, there have been ways to do this, but oftentimes you've had to sacrifice performance. You have had to create that kind of latency as that personalized request comes back because the page needs to be personalized for them. Or you've done a thing where you've done this all purely client-side. You've statically rendered a page, done a client-side fetch, had kind of a spinner loader state, and maybe caused some cumulative layout shift or jank because of that. So we want it to be relevant, but we also want it to still be performant. We want those core web vitals to be green. But we also want control. Both for the user, we want them to confidently be experiencing our website and knowing that these permutations are out there, things that we might not exactly know their experience of what they're going to see when they hit the .com. But we want them to be able to be confidently using our site, and we ourselves want to develop it confidently. We want to be able to ship quickly. We want to be able to iterate, and we want to be able to understand the code base that we are putting out into the world, even with these kind of intangibles and question marks. So yeah, relevance, the right features at the right time. Performance, a fast website free of jank. And control, develop, and ship quickly and confidently. And so we're going to use relevance as the lens that we really focus on as we walk through this code base today. We're going to show internationalization, localization, experimentation, personalization, and context awareness. That last one is kind of just this idea of maybe it's just something that you want to do with your site. What do you know and what can you do with it? So without further ado, we're going to kind of dive in on the code. And really, this is kind of where the deck ends on this presentation. I'd love for it to be a really kind of conversational walkthrough of the code base and clicking around on the website. So yeah, we built this website. It is shipworkshopshop.com. And one thing that I wanted to do here is while we're building this, I didn't want to have any very specific vendor story here in the room, because we have people who are Shopify, people who are commerce tools, people on SFCC. And then we have additional vendors, things like Bloomreach or Algolia, like tools you might be reaching for when it comes to this kind of data story. We're going to tell the story that really Vercel and Next can confidently impart upon you without necessarily wading too far out of the waters. I also didn't want it to be too much of a design story because design is a really personal experience for a lot of you developers. So my design language here was really specifically built around nobody needing to ask me to zoom in during the workshop. And hopefully you in the back can read that. Yes, mission accomplished. Okay, so we have this pretty basic e-commerce website. It has a homepage, it has PLPs, and it has PDPs, and it has a really simple kind of pseudo checkout cart situation. I didn't want to wade too deep into the checkout story because I didn't want to bore the Shopify people in the room who can't do composable checkout systems. I'd have to talk to everybody else and show them like Subway Surfers or something. So when we're clicking around, we scroll down, we got our big text, we got our sticky nav bar, we got our cart with a cart counter over here. We click through, we have our PLPs. You see that they're loading really fast. We're using what we call incremental static regeneration to load this site really quickly. I accidentally zoom in constantly. And we click in through a PDP. We have our variant picker. We have our add to cart button. And then here we have just some reviews that have been left for this particular product. And this little block here is actually using the Vercel AI SDK with AI Gateway to do review summaries for us. And then we're caching that in a component. So we'll look at that guy kind of towards the end when it comes to the contextual awareness. But we wanted to really show how AI works in this story too. 8 minutes and 12 seconds in was the first time I mentioned AI. Just marking that down for myself. So we're scrolling down. We have a leave a review feature that we'll talk through. We have our FAQs, just classic content. We have some recommended products based on the individual product that we'll talk about. And then we have down here where we'll start off our language and region selectors. So to tell the localization and internationalization story, there are a lot of different ways you can tell this and a lot of different strategies that you might need to use based on, say, things like canonical URL history. Like you might need ENUS to be part of your URL. You might need to 307 redirect to that. But if you're breaking new ground, you might not want to have that as part of your URL. You might just want to serve people up the experience that they want. So we show here with our language selector, if I click that guy through, that the site translates into Spanish, and it is still blazing fast because of our static caching of the page. So how did we do that? What's going on here? To show that, I'm going to jump into the code for the first time here. A lot of where we're going to spend our time during this workshop is going to be in middleware.ts, which if you haven't worked on a Next.js app or didn't see that our routing functions announcement, is this idea that you can put something between the request and the response. That is a really super powerful file that can exist right here. Because so much of what we're talking about with relevance is very dynamic concepts. It is a cookie, it is a header, it is a query parameter. It's these things that are sometimes pretty incompatible with caching stories because they require a server to know what that means, or something server-like to understand that round trip. It can't hit a static file for you and still do these kind of things. So middleware is a place that allows us to see all that dynamism in a real weight kind of way, and then do something with that dynamism. The best strategy that we love here, that I've used for, myself successfully, building a site, is taking that dynamism and then turning it into static routing information. When you're using a Next.js application, you go to a PDP, you go to the homepage, you're seeing variables in the path. And in the middleware, we can take these dynamic things and actually put that into the path for you. So it's going to serve up a static page with that information in the URL. Back in the day with Pages Router, if you were still on a slightly older Next.js version, you could also do this as well, but it would create this idea of very high cardinality. With App Router, based on our new kind of caching mechanisms, You can do a lot of information that exists in the URL, create a lot of high cardinality, and still have a maintainable code base. So scrolling down through the middleware file, and I actually helped dog food the V0 API while building this site. So you can thank V0 for a lot of the comments in the code. It's one of those great things that I'm terrible about doing myself that I love having an LLM there for me. The first thing we're going to see is that we have this matcher function here. And what this is doing is telling us this is the context where middleware should be fired off. So what I'm telling it here is any URL that passes through except for an API route, static routes, image routes, our favicon, and a directory called well-known that some of you may have used before should be served up middleware in the middle of that. So as we scroll down the middleware, we see that we bring in the request. So this is what's coming into the website. This is the full enchilada of information that is available. The first thing I like to do is I like to clone some information and make sure that we're not accidentally mutating anything that we might want to use elsewhere. And then I'm using a very simple bot detection, not nearly as cool as the bot detection that we announced today. That wasn't ready for me to use when I built this workshop, but I'm pretty stoked about being able to test that out. So I'm seeing if something is a bot, and then I'm basically saying, okay, if this is a bot, if this is Googlebot, if this is, the Slack unfurling bot, those kind of good bots that we might want to have. Even the bad bots, I want to serve them the control experience. I don't want to serve this kind of dynamic experience to them. I want to make sure that they see what is canonically correct at the URL. And then I'm setting a UTM medium value in there, which we'll get to in just a second. But a lot of the lifting that is being done in this middleware file is this line right here. Const root equals await pre-compute flags. So what we're doing is using the Vercel flags SDK, which there's a great workshop coming up shortly dedicated completely to that subject, to basically say, take all these dynamic values for me and turn them into something static that I'm going to put into my URL. So then what we end up doing here is in front of all of our URLs, we take that statically generated information and I make them what is called a root parameter. That root parameter is now accessible everywhere we want to go in the site. So information about language, locale, maybe experiments that they're enrolled in, all gets encoded into the URL for us, but in an invisible way to the user. Because we're sending them with a rewrite instead of a redirect on this URL. So they're still seeing shipworkshopshop.com/products/slug, but what we're actually serving up is shipworkshopshop.com/ this string of parameters for us /products/slug. And that is a really powerful way to extract this dynamic information. To circle back to where this conversation started, how does this relate to language and locale? Inside my flags, I have each function here is going to decide, what should I do based on this user? What do I know about the user and what should I show them? So the first one we have is the language flag. And for that, I have this deciding function. The first thing I'm looking for is have I cookied the user with a lang cookie? If I have, return that cookie. That is the value that they have set for us. I then look and say, do I have a reason to not do this kind of computation at all? Should I not waste my breath because it's a robot? Let's just return the default value. I'm then going to grab the accept language header. And I have a function here that parses that language header out for me and determines what the default value is. My site was built just having English and Spanish as options. So if either of those get a hit from us from the accept language header, we'll default into those. Otherwise, we're going to default into English simply because. If I find a parsed language value, I am going to set that cookie because we've established that the cookie hasn't been set yet in this logic. And I'm going to say, OK, going forward, they are now cookied. We no longer have to do this computation for us. Set that cookie, return this value. For locale, we're doing kind of the same thing. We have a list of valid countries that our website exists in. And we'll show them over here as I go down. We have Spanish, then we have United States, Argentina, Australia, Canada, Germany, Japan, Mexico, and the United Kingdom. Let's say I pick Japan here. You'll see that we've done a price book lookup, and now all of my prices are in yen. So what I did with this feature here is these buttons are actually updating that cookie value for me using a server action. And then we're refreshing the page. And when I do that refresh, it goes through that middleware again, sees that I've set a new locale. Where'd it go? Sees that I've set a new language, refreshes the page, but serves us that statically cached content based on those values that we have. So in this example of localization, it's just a language cookie and it's just a locale cookie. And then we have a couple of different ways that we're actually acting upon that knowledge. In my CMS, for instance, I would have my translated content, and when I fetch the page, I would grab the translated content based on the language. When it comes to UI, I have a translation JSON file that has kind of statically configured values, and on the server, I can pull these values out and don't have to bring them into the client, making for smaller bundles. And to get this content, I actually use an LLM to help me translate it, so fingers crossed that my Spanish wasn't terrible. So that is kind of the first idea of how we get to personalization. If you go to the Next.js.org docs, you'll see plenty of examples of libraries that are actually going to kind of help leverage this same approach of dynamic to static. But if you didn't want to necessarily grab a full library, wanted to be very DIY about your approach, it can be as simple as parsing out the headers and creating a cookie and using that cookie going forward. The next example I want to talk about of relevance is one that we hear about a lot, and the talk about it can sometimes turn a little bit contentious, and that is experimentation. As a show of hands, how many people are doing A/B experimentation at their place of work? A decent amount of showing of hands. How many of you are doing that fully client-side? Interesting. All right, yeah. So we have found on Next.js that sometimes client-side experimentation is not necessarily the most elevated experience when it comes to going to your website. Because usually there are two approaches when it comes to handling client-side, to mitigating what we would refer to as jank. One is that you make that A/B experimentation script a blocking script. You make sure that if you're using something like Optimizely on the client side, that it is fully initialized and ready to go and serves up the A/B experiment without that client-side flash of unstyled content. So somebody might be landing on a homepage and we're showing one image, and then suddenly they're bucketed into an experiment, and that image disappears and becomes a different image. That can be kind of a tricky experience, and a lot of people on your marketing team might say, hey, can we do anything about this? And because it's fully on the client, there isn't necessarily much mitigation you can do other than possibly tanking your core web vitals to get there. So if you're doing experiments that are oftentimes below the fold, I think client-side experimentation can still be a really great, useful tool, especially because it gives non-technical users usually have a kind of WYSIWYG, kind of the feature set that they might be looking for that lets them do experimentation outside of the engineering organization. What I'll be showing today is server-side experimentation, so an engineering-led experimentation story. One of the big advantages of this is that you're making something a little bit more high fidelity. Oftentimes, client-side experimentation is kind of more or less using a jQuery script and sort of painting your website for you. That can be really tricky when it comes to a big swing experiment because it can't necessarily hook natively into your application and your application's functionality without exposing some kind of escape hatch, like binding your shopping cart to the window or doing some sort of trick that lets that client-side experiment work. So here on the site, I, in a very similar way, so we can go into the middleware here, created this idea of using the same approach, but to show experiments. We have a flag for show an orange CTA. This is always the first A/B experiment I run any place I go to. Amazon CTA is orange, make your CTA orange, see if that CVR goes up. The other one I have is I have this promo banner here, and maybe we want to show it, maybe we don't want to show it. We want to see the efficacy of showing this link to people. So the setup is kind of the same. We look for a cookie first. If that cookie value exists, we're checking to see if they've been bucketed into this experiment. If not, we're just doing some math decision. We're doing a coin toss, effectively, and either showing them that they should see this experiment or showing them that they shouldn't. And similar to how we handled the localization, we can actually toggle the cookie value to see how different things could be. I put a secret little menu in the app. So if you're running locally and you do Command-Shift-M, you should get a little secret slide over menu. And that's going to let you toggle some different values. We'll have demo mode, which we'll show in a bit, and medium as well. But right now on the show promo, I'm set to true. And the orange CTA, I'm set to false. Let's set the promo to false. And you see that the page refreshes. And we don't see any kind of appearance or disappearance event happening there. And similarly, if I were to set my CTA to orange, we have our orange CTA, and it loads and continues to load based on the fact that we have that cookie. So we're not going to see any kind of flicker there. These examples don't necessarily show that kind of big swing that we talked about. But if we actually had different functionality hooked to the button, for instance, like we are firing off a very different add to cart event for one user than the other, this would be an approach that we'd be able to do that. And yeah, so that is there with experimentation. And with this approach, one thing that's very cool about using Flags SDK on Vercel specifically is that if you have the Vercel toolbar, we can actually hook those flags into the toolbar. And so people who are using your site, people who are using those preview deployments, you can pass them over to, and they can actually do this manipulation there in the toolbar level. So this is a really great way to kind of do that QA. And then the one last advantage of those server-based experiments is you're building something with decent fidelity, so the win implementation is actually really fast. It's as simple as navigating, that flag logic. Moving forward, for a lot of people, you wouldn't necessarily just do a flag as true/false. You'd need some sort of reporting. Probably want to, even if it's server-side, hook it into some sort of tooling that your team is using. So if you read the docs for the Flags SDK, you'll show how it works with things like Optimizely, Launch Darkly, StatSig, Dynamic Yield, Flagsmith. All of these different flag providers are going to be able to help you hook into that. The only thing to really, I think, be mindful of is going back to that middleware code. Middleware fires in front of the request when you tell it to do that. And unfortunately, the laws of physics still apply, so latency gets applied. So the more you are attempting to do here, the heavier logic you're thinking about doing could add up to milliseconds of latency. And the more milliseconds you have of latency, that can possibly raise your TTFB. So when you're doing these kind of compute logics in your middleware, you want to be really mindful that you're not doing anything too particularly heavy, too many round trips. So there's a lot of great documentation on the Flags SDK site about how we recommend this being like a really light touch kind of event for you. The next thing we want to show off is, I think, one of the really big ones that we hear about, which is personalization. We're not going to show a complete and total personalization story here, but there are a lot of great providers. We mentioned earlier, I think Bloomreach is in the room here. They have great tooling on this. Algolia has great tooling. Constructor, once again, Dynamic Yield is pretty good at this too. We can have an ABCD there. These are really great tools that basically say, okay, I'm going to provide this tool information about the user, whatever I have. They have an authenticated state. Maybe I've cookied them from a couple of different events. I'm going to pass that in, and it's going to tell me, what is relevant to this moment. Where that can be kind of tricky is that is going to, if you completely were to atomize the user and then try to pass that into the URL, it's going to be a completely atomized experience every single time. And that will still kind of create that latency. If it is something that isn't necessarily a cached value, what do? And so we look at this PDP and we look at things have changed, but by and large, the information and the layout are pretty, and the feature set are pretty similar from variation of this page to variation of this page. We can statically cache this page and then figure out what needs to be different and use a feature that releasing soon that we call partial pre-rendering. And that lets us serve up the page statically, find the things that are dynamic, and kind of use what we call a suspense boundary to protect that dynamic information and let us make that round trip to the server while still serving up that really fast TTFB and getting that static caching. To show that, earlier I mentioned that we were doing this, this review summaries functionality. Let me actually pull up our localhost version of this. This is the deployed version. And I am over here, so let's do pm dev https. So I'm going to show how the AI SDK can possibly update. Here we go. We got Miss Flux Parka. So you're seeing here that right now we were streaming in that review summary from the server side based on information that was provided to it on the page. But that didn't need to be a blocking event for loading the rest of the page. For a lot of people, they might do a pattern similar to this, but purely on the client side. And that requires you to expose API architecture, possibly requires you to pass tokens or cookies that you might not necessarily feel comfortable doing, so you have to pass it through a proxy layer. You have to do a lot of work to do that kind of feature, where here, the data we want exists at the component that we have. We're also using the same approach for doing our recommended products as well. It's passing in the product. We're then passing it through OpenAI embeddings to find similar products in our code base, and then rendering those products out. Now, how is this a personalized story? That's really kind of contextual awareness of the page and showing me this possibly dynamic data in a different request, but it's not necessarily personal to the user. So to demonstrate what a personalized experience could be like, I'm going to add this product to our cart. I'm going to go over to my shopping cart. My shopping cart page loads. I'm going to do a pseudo checkout event. Imagine I'm going through the full thing. I'm using Apple Pay. I'm doing all the good stuff. And then I'm going to come back to the home page. And then so I just bought the Mist Flux Parka for $120. Now I'm scrolling down the home page. I've arrived a little bit later, and I got, because you bought Mist Flux Parka, I've used that partial pre-rendered suspended component to look for the fact that I just did a cookie based on that checkout, and it told me what products I had purchased. And so we're able to say, okay, let's follow them around based on this cookie. We know now that they're an existing customer. Let's get them to check out. You could imagine taking this even further with your homepage. You could change up all kinds of things. Anything you can sessionize the user on becomes fair game and accessible to you. It really kind of becomes your data management story. One thing that we thought about a lot at Maiden is if you're a repeat visitor, initially you land on the homepage, maybe you saw our commercial, maybe you came in through an ad. Let's teach you who Maiden is. Let's tell our brand story. We're really proud of it. But if I were to see that you have already purchased, maybe that space is less useful for being user education and more show them products related to things that they bought. Tell a completely different experience on the homepage. We can do that just by being able to look at the data that we had. So that is, I think, one of the ways that we think about personalization is what information can you grab, and then where on the site can we place that information in. On the PDP, which we can go over to here really quick, is our products page. That component that we are rendering out there looks like this guy. And so that suspense boundary that we mentioned, this is kind of the idea of it, is I'm saying, okay, find those products for me. That might involve a header. That might involve some sort of dynamic value. And in the meantime, I've suspended this. It exists in the server, and I'm going to show a fallback that right now just kind of generates a temporary placeholder before it's able to hit that dynamic data. And if that dynamic data happens to already be cached, like this is a repeat visit, then it's going to be served up in milliseconds instantaneously. And with new features coming to Next.js, you in the best of all worlds, won't even ever see that fallback screen if you're hitting a cached request. So the last aspect I want to talk about, and I want to leave some time to get to Q&A and to have more questions, is this idea of more contextual awareness. This is kind of the most hands-on, on-the-ground example I can think of is your growth guys come up to your team. You're working on your next sprint or however you guys are building the site, and they are talking about that they are absolutely stinging from the fact that people click on a paid ad, land on your PDP, and then bounce in like 0.7 seconds. That's a really expensive bounce, and it's really annoying. And they ask you, is there anything we can do about that? And if the answer isn't, could we make the product cheaper, you might have to be a little creative when it comes to thinking about what you want to do. And so a pattern that we found that worked really well for us, let's go back to this park as an example. I'm scrolling, and I'm an organic visitor. I have organic traffic. My UTM medium does not exist as a query parameter at any particular point. I've just come to this website naturally. It's going to show me reviews, and then it's going to show me frequently asked questions, and then it's going to show me those other recommended products if I've kind of reached the bottom of the page, and it's giving me an out. That's a better option than me completely bouncing from the page. But what if I clicked on an ad for parka, and this wasn't the parka that I was really thinking of? It's an expensive click. But let's see what would happen if I were to add the UTM medium here. And this is shorthand. The usual paid clicks are a much broader spectrum. But here in UTM medium paid, I added this little section here. This user arrived through a paid ad, so let's make their visit count. And you can see that once again, I'm rendering that out statically because we turned this into a static value in the URL. And then what I did is I decided to rearrange the PDP based on this information. And so I'm scrolling below the fold, and if I got to this point and I was just hitting the reviews and I wasn't feeling it, and I said, nah, I would click away. But there's a possibility that by moving these recommended products up, I'm able to give them other options to help kind of salvage that click and keep them on the site. So this is just one way of thinking about like what can we do based on something that was usually dynamic, because without that static inference of it, we might see a bunch of things shift. You might be doing a full server page instead of a statically cached page, which can be more latency and also more just usage of your servers, which can translate to more cost. This lets us keep that static paradigm while also being able to really dynamically respond to the situation at hand. So yeah, we moved the recommended products up. We moved made sure the reviews stayed here, and then moved more of the content below the fold. If somebody's really engaged and really interested, they might be able to scroll all the way down to this. So there are a lot more things that we put into our code base that we wrote for you guys. And then I realized with the 40-minute workshop, I've already been talking for 33 minutes straight, it feels like, and I want to get into more interactivity. So there's a lot that we kind of left unspoken about in this demonstration, but hopefully the comments in the code base kind of show things like server actions, more things that you can do with partial pre-rendering. We're showing off use cache remote, which is a coming soon way of fetching and tagging data that will really change the way you're able to merchandise your sites. Really exciting stuff. Would really love to be able to continue the conversation after the workshop, after Ship. Feel free to reach out to us. We love talking about this stuff. If you ask us a question, we will talk to you all day. But yeah, I want to stop there and see if we have any questions from the audience. And yeah, Diggory, you got the mic.
Are there any build performance or build size issues that's taken into consideration? You have a lot of different possible flags and combinations.
That's a great question. So what I did here is I am actually doing kind of on-demand page building. So when you look at our URLs here, we more or less have a given dynamic parameter, and I opted not to pre-build all the permutations that would exist with this. I let it kind of get built on demand because the Flags SDK builds our setup is so quick. I didn't find it valuable in this example to create all those permutations. Now, if you were wanting to completely static render your entire site at build time, cardinality does become a big issue because you would be statically building every permutation, which, for my flags, I think I had 5 flags in there, so that'd be 2 to the 5th, which is a decent number of variations on every single page. You probably wouldn't want to take this approach with pre-build. And that's definitely something to consider, yeah. In that model with the kind of build on demand, what we end up having is kind of basically one person kind of feels the sting of latency to make the initial build of your page. Generally on our infrastructure, it's still usually a pretty fast kind of, it's like you'd experience it if you're going fully server side. So not world-beating numbers, but still pretty good numbers. But that ensures that every person who follows after gets that cached request, and they'll get that classic sub 1 second full trip. Yeah.
How does middleware.ts get involved when user hits a particular request?
When it hits a particular request? Yeah, great question. So that is that matcher config that we ran there at the beginning. You export a matcher. In this case, I had an extra header because I was doing an experiment. This one isn't necessary. I found like 4 things that I would change about my code base while doing this demo. Sorry, guys. But we have this source, which here is a regex. And it's a negative regex. So it's basically saying if it's an API route, if it's a rendered image, if it's like my favicon, you can also add like sitemap.xml, other values here that you don't necessarily need like dynamism in rendering strategies with. If it's any of those values, we're going to go straight to the file, straight to that request. But otherwise, we're going to put the middleware in front, is what that matcher is saying. So by exporting this named value of config, that tells us what files and what routes middleware should be running on.
Cool. I'm glad you got to the paid ad example because I was already thinking about reordering the site. But have you done any like experimentation with a step further of maybe making a site that's reactive to how the user uses it, so they always go to the reviews, throw that to the top in the future? Or you think that might be too heavy lifting?
No, that is also interesting. I think what that comes down to is a thing that I think of more as like cohort personalization as opposed to individual user personalization. Like, what do we know about this type of user? And I think that's a similar story we were talking about with the homepage. Like, we know that this is an educated user. And if they come in and they are frequently clicking on PDPs, we know that they have a purchase history that we're able to pull through. Like, they probably want the product in the reviews. And so, like, yeah, let's make absolutely sure that they're getting bumped up for that above all else. Maybe even put reviews above. Maybe even change our product displaying here to have more review-related data here with a immediately scroll to reviews kind of setup. But yeah, that's the level of dynamism that you can definitely get. It's really up to how am I able to capture that information and make it aware inside my app. And there are 1,000 different ways to cut that. This becomes a much more I think for a lot of us, especially who come from Shopify land, the big challenge that we have is people don't log into Shopify very often until they're using Cache or until they're using Shop app. So we might use that as metadata or some sort of database based on the user. But if they've switched devices, we don't necessarily know, who they are. So it can be a complex data story, but a really easy implementation story. All right.
Maybe all good for now. Yeah, thank you. Find Dan afterwards. He's always down to talk about this stuff. That was great, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.